Nothing kills a villain faster than a gacha banner, but can Phrolova escape her fate? Gacha games live and die by the characters they introduce, and their appeal is not just their appearance or their strengths, but also how they shape the stories we're all experiencing together. A new character isn't just another fighter you drop into your team. They're a new person to meet, a new story to unravel, sometimes even a herald of a new direction for the game's main narrative. But what happens when the new recruit was once the villain you loved to hate? Redemption arcs can be compelling, but gacha storytelling rarely has the subtle patience required to make them work. Far too often, they're revealed to be a misunderstood anti-hero and the narrative just waves away their crimes. We want strong villains in our stories because they push the heroes to their limits, but at the same time, we crave characters we can love. And when a villain becomes playable, the tension between those two desires can cause serious problems. So what's the point of villains in a gacha game? Are they doomed to be retconned the moment they become playable? And why do we care either way? Phrolova is due to be released in the next version of Wuthering Waves, and she's a little different to the other characters so far. Up until now, she's been a true villain. She's an important member of the Fractsidus, a mysterious group who want to push humanity to evolve to the next level, and will stop at nothing to achieve their goal. But while they claim their intentions are good, and we may eventually hear some outlandish justification explaining that their goal is reasonable, it's undeniable that they have a lot of blood on their hands, and they're pretty clearly the bad guys in the story so far. Will she remain a villain once she becomes playable, or will we see a significant shift in her characterization? Wu's main competitors are the Hoya Games, and for whatever reason that company seems hell-bent on painting any antagonist as a fundamentally good person the moment they make them playable. From what I've heard, Kura were a little less inclined to do that in their previous games, but Wuwa is perhaps a little more high profile. There may be other gachas out there which handle this better, but they're much more niche. So far, Wuwa has had two playable characters who were portrayed as antagonistic at first, and both of them are noticeably less so by the time we know more about them. Cantarella's femme fatale persona was a front she used to hide her true intentions and protect her people, while Camellia turned out to be just a little bit insane. That can be seen as the beginnings of a pattern, and considering the approach taken by the other prominent gachas, it's understandable that some people are a bit nervous that Phrolova too might have a change of heart now that she's due to become playable. But is that really something worth being nervous about? Storytelling is a game of trade-offs, not a simple formula. What are the pros and cons of making villains relatable? Why do people care? How does the gacha affect this? And what do I hope Kuro actually end up doing? Before we get into it, it's worth noting the difference between expectations and standards. Some people will dismiss this entire discussion because we're talking about gacha games and they feel that any level of expectations are pointless. Personally, I expect gacha stories to fall below the standards that I really want. I play them anyway for other reasons, such as their fun gameplay. When they do achieve the standard that I want, I'm pleasantly surprised. When they don't, I kinda shrug and move on, though I do have fun dissecting where they went wrong. But I strongly disagree with anyone who says that gachas cannot raise the standards. They just don't bother investing in it, presumably since they don't see the need. Regardless, I think it's interesting to talk about. To understand the pros and cons of making villains relatable, we first need to consider why they exist in the first place. My first instinct when I hear people say they wish that villains would stay evil is that it sounds almost childish, like they want their stories to remain simplistic. But if you think about it even a little, it's much more complex and there are trade-offs either way. In large part, the confusion surrounding the discussion comes from people conflating the terms antagonist and villain. They're used interchangeably, but there is a subtle difference between the two which makes people's perspectives on Phrolova much more clear. An antagonist is someone or something which opposes the protagonist, standing in the way of them achieving their goals. They provide obstacles and challenges which the protagonist has to overcome, and create the adverse conditions which reveal the protagonist's true nature. There is no bravery without fear, no heroism without adversity, and the antagonist's role is to provide that essential ingredient. Antagonists come in many flavors, and a villain is the most classic archetype. From the protagonist's perspective, they are fundamentally immoral and malicious, and they always intend to inflict harm or disrupt the protagonist and their goals. Often, the entire intent of the protagonist is to defeat the villain, to put a stop to their nefarious plans and save the world from whatever fate they had intended. Compare that to some different types of antagonist. An adversary, someone who is not inherently evil or malicious, but who has some tangential goal which conflicts with the protagonists. A rival, someone who has the same goal as the protagonist but wants to keep any rewards or accolades to themselves. Or an authority figure, someone who holds a position of power over the protagonist and might calmly disagree with their goals. There's so much variety to antagonists, even things like nature, moral dilemmas, societal problems, or even the character's own internal flaws can provide a compelling opposition to the protagonist. And each type of antagonist has a different effect on story which includes them. Villains, in particular, emphasize a dualistic view of absolute good versus absolute evil. This contrast paints the protagonist in a heroic light. If the force they are fighting is objectively evil, then they are by definition objectively good, right? But the real world is messy and complex, and there are downsides and disagreements to so many obviously good causes. It reminds me of Nightblood, a sentient sword in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, who was created with the desire to fulfill one eternal command: destroy evil. But the sword completely lacks the ability to identify evil, a fantastic metaphor for how the best intentions still need direction and perspective, and how any realistic world is too complex a place for such a simplistic ideal. But while some stories anchored by a villain do go down that overly simplistic route, not all do. Including a truly villainous antagonist can give the story more space to explore moral nuance elsewhere instead. For example, there's that ever-popular question: do the ends justify the means? If the antagonist is truly evil, then what lengths should be considered acceptable? What actions would remain immoral? Different people inevitably draw the line in different places. The lack of nuance in the villain can actually provide fertile ground for cracks to grow between the forces of good. And there can, of course, be more than one antagonist. Those other flavors can be included in the story to give it extra nuance. Just look at The Lord of the Rings. Sauron is an antagonistic force bent on destroying the world with no nuance or characterization at all, and the goal is to defeat him. But there are so many other antagonists as well. Gollum, for example, is more of an adversary than a pure villain, and whose guidance was key to Frodo and Sam's successful infiltration into Mordor. The villain is still there in the background, providing that driving force behind the hero's goals. There can simply be more to the story than their direct confrontation. Before we get to the specifics of the Fractsidus and Phrolova, there's another important facet to this discussion: the idea that playable characters in gacha games cannot be true villains because evil simply will not sell. There is some truth in this, but it is a very questionable truth. There are absolutely people who would be less inclined to pull for a character they feel is evil. Many are motivated by the character's personality and backstory more than anything, and other considerations like aesthetics, playstyle, and power level are secondary concerns. However, even for those of us who feel that way, I'd argue that it's not a question of disliking the idea of pulling for an evil character. It's about whether we feel a connection to them, whether we enjoy their presence. We might be less likely to feel that way towards a villain, but it's not impossible. If a compelling and charismatic villain were to become playable, I don't think I'd have any problem putting them in my teams. Take Cristoforo, for example. So far, I'd say he's pretty clear-cut villain, and yet he's very charismatic and very entertaining, and I would probably pull for him if he were available right now and had an enjoyable playstyle. Unfortunately, he has a very NPC face design. There are also contrarians who would be more likely to pull for a character who is truly evil, though I'd suspect this is a much smaller niche. And ultimately, there are also players who will pull for anything with big enough chesticles and a powerful enough kit. And it's also important to note that this is entirely separate from the idea of actually doing evil deeds within the game. In games like Red Dead Redemption 2, I personally really struggle to do any of the negative interactions. I was forced to when I did my 100% completionist run, since the chain of bandit challenges requires you to do all sorts of dishonorable deeds. I feel way too much empathy towards the pixel people in the game, and found it really uncomfortable to take advantage of them. I'm much happier doing a fully honorable playthrough whenever possible. In the gachas I've played, the characters we pull for do not affect the story in any way. When we get a new character, we do not gain the ability to play through the narrative from their perspective or even interact with the world as if we were that person. Their presence is strictly limited to the combat and exploration alone. However, what does absolutely sell is relatability, and a more subtle side to the question of whether villains sell is that the simplicity of their portrayal often results in a lack of relatability. And this, I think, is where the conflict inherent in playable villains in gacha games exists. Most people struggle to relate to someone truly villainous. Even people who have done horrible things tend to see themselves as a good person, and when told the story of how their actions affected others, they are unable to comprehend the truth of that description because they just cannot see themselves as the villain. In stories, the more villainous an antagonist is, the less relatable they are. As more context is added to the villain's story, they tend to become at least a little more relatable, and in our perception, they move away from the villain category and towards a different type of antagonist altogether. On the other hand, lacking that context can make a villain feel shallow and unfinished, so this can be a hard line to walk if you want a truly evil villain. There's a whole multi-dimensional spectrum here, and any combination can be interesting, and a story about someone changing along this axis can be compelling too. And note that this applies to heroes too. A pure and unblemished good hero can feel a little bland, and one with flaws can feel much more interesting. It's much more common to see a redemption arc, however, because the movement in that direction is a story about positive change. It lets us have our compelling antagonist and slowly turn them into someone we can root for. There's much more to this, of course, but the general idea that nuance makes a villain more relatable at the expense of making them at least a little less of a pure villain should be pretty clear. So where do Phrolova and the Fractsidus in general actually belong? Does it make sense for people to feel a little uneasy at the prospect of her becoming playable? The Fractsidus are not the most evil force at play in Soul 3. That distinction goes to the Thronodians, which are embodiments of all that is evil in humanity's subconscious. However, from what we know right now, the actions of the Fractsidus are very much villainous. For one thing, their goal is to evolve humanity. We may learn some further justification for this, but so far this very much looks like a small cabal of people aiming to make an irreversible decision which affects the lives of every other person on the planet, and that is not a good start. And even if there is some way to justify their goal, the means they use to work towards that end are transparently villainous too. They seek to resurrect the Thronodians to trigger the next lament as a catalyst for change, and they do not care about the deaths and devastation this would cause along the way. There are some potential hooks which Kuro could use to shift our perspective on them, but so far, while they aren't true villains like the Thronodians, they come very close due to the combination of their questionable goal and even more questionable methods. I would be unsurprised if that slowly changes over time, but time is key for that to work, and it would take some impressive storytelling for them to change our perspective on them so much so quickly. So far, in our encounters with Phrolova, we have seen her directly orchestrating the worst of the Fractsidus' actions. She is the one who summoned the TDs in Jinsho to trigger the Thronodians' awakening, and she was central antagonist in Raguna and now Septimon as well. However, despite the gravity of her actions, the impression she gives is one of a detached observer. She talks about everything as if it's a play, and acts as if she is a conductor pulling the strings behind the scenes, which is in fact her title. And this does bring up interesting implications when you consider that a conductor's actions are forever guided by the invisible hand of the composer, especially when you consider that Cristoforo is known as the playwright. There are hints that she has a tragic past, and there is much more depth to her than we have seen so far. But right now, she is very much on that borderline at the edge of pure villain. With all that in mind, it's pretty easy to understand why some people are nervous. In those other games, there are characters who were portrayed as villains, but whose misdeeds were swept aside when they became playable. The sudden switch from villain to them being relatable and friendly was jarring, and led to the character feeling inauthentic, like a version of the same person from an alternate universe had taken their place. It's not impossible for a despicable villain to go through a satisfying redemption arc. It just takes time and storytelling skill and nuance, all things which have often been sadly missing from gacha stories. When people say they want Phrolova to remain a villain, one of the things I think they're trying to express is the feeling that if she were to have a redemption arc, it's the kind of storytelling which would likely feel incredibly rushed if it were to happen in a single patch. Since there's no longer enough time for Kuro to tell that kind of story, if they want her to feel like she's the same character we've known so far, their options are limited. There are three main paths they could take with Phrolova. If Kuro keep her as a villain, then great. It would be a clear dividing line which shows that they are now far more confident in the story they're telling, and we'd have an interesting ride ahead of us for the rest of the journey. If they find some way to move her a little further into morally grey territory, then as long as the story is done well, that could also be great. This feels the most likely to me, given the hints we've had so far. Its success would just depend on execution. And if they just throw away her character as portrayed so far and replace her with an uwu doppelganger, then that would break immersion and it would really suck. It's not impossible that they could justify this with some story machinations, but it would be a really hard sell for a lot of people, and it would risk so much disappointment. At this point, I'd be legitimately surprised if that was the path they chose. We're taught to see the world through the lens of good and evil, and always assume that we are on the side of objective good, while those who oppose us are objectively wrong and evil. The stories we tell reflect this. But the world is not so simple, and many prefer stories with greater moral nuance, protagonists who are as imperfect as the rest of us, antagonists who have a valid point, redemption arcs, corruption arcs, moral questions with no easy answer. Villains of pure evil can have their place in their stories too, but they're far from the only option, and in Phrolova's case, it's just a question of what direction they choose to take and whether their storytelling can pull it off. I'm excited to see what happens. Until next time.